Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Waste and Recycling Middle East and Africa Virtual Forum. Today's session focuses on COVID-19 effects on plastics recycling markets and possibilities. I'm joined here by eminent industry experts who will share their observations and analyze the effects and likely long-term impact of the coronavirus on the plastics recycling sector, examine the critical challenges and opportunities, and also how it could possibly push the industry towards a more circular economy approach. Now, let me introduce our panelists. Mr. Surendra Singh, he is the founder and chairman of Gemini Corporation, one of the world's leading circular economy market makers. Since 1989, the company is engaged in worldwide sourcing, recycling, and distribution of plastics, paper, metal, and rubber, giving second life to over 2 million tons of materials each year. He is a board member of the Alliance to End Plastic Waste and has led Gemini to become a member of Ellen MacArthur Foundation and GPAP of World Economic Forum. Mr. Surendra has won several international awards from the recycling fraternity, including the US President's E Award, and is passionate about sharing with society. Dr. Steve Wang is the founder and CEO of Fukutomi Recycling Company, which was established in 1984. As one of the leaders in the plastics recycling industry, Fukutomi operates in a global market with its well-established networks and affiliates worldwide, including mainland China, UK, many European countries, USA, and South Africa. Further, the company operates several processing facilities in Hong Kong, Vietnam, and Malaysia. Dr. Steve is also the executive president of the China Sustainable Plastics Association, and he is a passionate long-distance runner, having completed over 100 marathon races. At present, he is also an observer for the United Nations Environment Programme working groups. Mr. Shelly Singh, our next panelist, is founder and CEO of Sustain Mantra. He is a sustainable development strategist. He holds a chemical engineering degree and an MBA and has 3 decades of experience in chemicals, plastics, and packaging, with leading MNCs in the AP region in senior leadership roles. He is a member of the Environment and Recycling Committee at All India Plastics Manufacturers Association and has held board positions in Indian Institute of Packaging, Society of Plastic Engineers India, and All India Printing Inks Manufacturer Association. He is associated with UNDP as an implementation partner for a MRF and is also working on developing sustainable apparels. Welcome, gentlemen. Thank you all for joining us. Before we begin, as usual, I'd like to let you all know that we will be taking questions from the audience in a while, once the panelists have given their overview of the situation in various parts of the world. You can type out any relevant question or comment in the chat box that appears below. I now request Mr. Surendra to give us an overview of the current plastics recycling market situation. Over to you, Mr. Surendra. Mr. Surendra?
Thank you, Mrs. Swiley, for the kind introduction. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Are you aware that every month we are using nowadays about 3 million units of masks? Well, I should say 89 million units of masks, 3 million units of masks every day. We are using every day 2.5 million units of gloves all around the world. And I believe this quantity could be substantially higher because Germany is talking about a very big figure of 12 million units. But in any case, the COVID has proved beyond doubt that we cannot live without plastics even for a few days or maybe even for a few hours. We wake up in the morning and the first thing we do, we look for our mobile phone. The mobile phone is made of with plastics. We drive to the office in a car. The car is made up with 15 to 20% plastics. Then we use computers, laptop, plastic folders. The list is endless. In fact, the plastic touches the life of every person, everywhere, every day. The COVID has pushed the consumption of single-use plastics. The WHO believes that every month, and it's going to increase every month, 89 units of masks is being used. Every month, around 79 units of gloves are being used. But this has brought a different challenge, the challenge of collection, recycling, and disposal of these masks and gloves. The world, particularly the developing world, is not equipped, they don't have infrastructure to handle these huge volume of masks and gloves. The rec pickers or the waste pickers. Well, ladies and gentlemen, I like to call them reclaimers to give respect and dignity to their profession. So I request all of you to replace the word rec pickers in your vocabulary by the word reclaimers. I think they are doing a great job at this time, but they are even reluctant to pick up these masks and gloves. Therefore, there is a big challenge. And of course, the developed world is working very hard to find a solution. And here is an opportunity for the brave entrepreneurs to find a solution to this big challenge. But the point which I want to make that the benefits of plastic and its uses have been brought to the fore during the COVID crisis. Whether we like it or not, whether we compare plastics with tobacco, with evil, we need plastics and we need it desperately. And equally, we need to have its own recycling. We need to find solutions. We need to make sure that the importance of recycling is not lost on the world. Of course, like all industry, the plastic recycling industry has suffered and is suffering a lot. The prices of recycled material have gone down substantially. So much so that in the Western world, the European recycling industry is warning and claiming that the recycling could cease to be profitable. This recycling industry is reducing production, or some of them are closing the production. The prime plastics prices are extremely low compared to 2 years. In case of HDP, for example, when you compare the prices since 2018 beginning, the prices are almost 50%. The prices of PP is almost 30-40% down compared to the prices prevailing in the beginning of 2018. So the economics of the recycling have become very difficult. And also the collections, people don't want to collect at these low prices. And if the situation stays like this, the plastics waste might end up in the landfill instead of being recycled. And along the value chain, it provides a lot of jobs. Those would be affected as well. Therefore, the recycling industry is calling for substantial assistance from the European Union and the member states. As you might have noticed, as you might have heard, many countries, developed world, particularly US, European Union, Japan, they have opened up their treasuries to make sure that the impact of COVID is reduced economically and socially. So the industry, the recycling industry is calling to the Western governments, to the European Union, that please put plastics on a priority sector in its recovery plan. Otherwise, the European targets which they have set would be very difficult to achieve. Europe has set a target of use of 10 million recycled plastics by the year 2025. At the moment, Europe is recycling about 7 million tons from their own in-house waste. And also Europe has a target of recycling 60% of packaging waste by the year 2025. But without the assistance from the government, I think it's going to be a very challenging task. Currently, the European overall recycling rate is about 33%, which is relatively better compared to the Russia, where it's only 6-7% is recycled. US, it has come down to almost 10%. And to give you a global perspective, we generate about 300 to 350 million tons of plastic waste every year, but shamefully, less than 16% is recycled. And if I see the world around, shamefully, the global recycling rate is coming down and have come down. I'm sure in 2019, the recycling rate came down. In 2020, it's going to come down. People ask me questions. Is there any official data? I don't have any official data, but my company collects plastic scrap from over 350 locations in 60 countries. I smell it, I feel it, and I can see that it's going down. And there is absolutely certainty, ladies and gentlemen, that from the beginning of next year, the plastic recycling business would go down substantially after the introduction of Basel Convention. From January 1st, the rules of Basel Convention is going to come in impact. And would you believe from the beginning of next year, every agreement, every contract, every shipment between two countries have to be approved by the respective environment authorities of those countries. So you imagine there needs to be a shipment from Bangladesh to India. This contract has to be approved by the environment authorities of both Bangladesh and Europe. You imagine a situation where Ghana needs to export plastic scrap to Nigeria. These contracts have to be approved by the respective governments. And if they are going to use Europe as a test example, there would be need for bank guarantees too. It's going to be extremely cumbersome, extremely bureaucratic, administrative work, a lot of administrative work. And who would do this work in these developing worlds? I've been shouting from my top of my voice that maybe the developed world would be able to cope with the administrative work, but the developing world, it's going to be extremely difficult. And with this challenge, we have all responsibility that the importance of plastic recycling is not lost on the world. Otherwise, our great grandchildren would see millions, billions, not the millions of tons of plastic waste when they would be watching after 20, 30 years. But now, as a company, as a responsible organization, what Gemini is doing to make sure that the importance of plastic is not lost. First of all, you might have heard about Alliance to End the Plastic Waste. This association has been formed early last year in 2019 by the leading plastic prime producers in Singapore, where Mr. Shellender lived there. And this association, this alliance has the founding members, all the leading producers like Reliance, Sabic, you name it, Exxon, BP, Sasol, and also the users like Procter and Gamble, Pepsi, Cola, and they have committed use of investment of $1.5 billion of money for the next 5 years to end the plastic waste. I happen to be a board member of this alliance because somebody has to know the ground realities. And I feel even during this COVID crisis, the alliance has been processing projects all across the world. If you have a project which you believe can reduce the plastic waste, which can promote the recycling, which can promote the use of recycled content, you may contact them directly. They are doing a wonderful job. World Economic Forum have also started a project called Global Plastic Actions Partnership to promote recycling, to promote sustainability, to have more circularity. And the founding members include all these big converters, and also the funding has come from UK, Canada. And here again, the objective is to make sure that the importance of plastic recycling is not lost. And only last week, they invited Gemini to become a part of this GPAF from the World Economic Forum. And we would continue to play a very important role to make sure that the recycling importance is not lost on the world. You heard about Ellen MacArthur, which was founded in 2010 for sustainability and circular economy. It also has launched a new plastic economy initiative. 450 companies have given their commitment to reduce plastic waste, to use more recycled content, and they would be needing 6 million tons of recycled contents. Here is a big opportunity for recyclers because based on the current scenario, it's going to be very difficult to have excess of 6 million tons by 2025 based on mechanical recycling only. So a big opportunity for the entrepreneur engaged in plastic recycling business. Talking about the current business scenario, of course, in Europe, the generation availability is very tight. So the prices have gone up in the recent period, and the collections, as I said to you, is going to be very difficult with these prices. But I see during last 2-3 weeks there is an uptick in the demand and in the prices, and I hope this continues, this is sustained, so people do not lose any hope, and we can look for a brighter future. That's all from my side. Thank you, Ms. Walia, for the kind opportunity, for the kind introduction. Thank you so much. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Surendra. It was quite enlightening, nice of you to just sum up very well what is happening right now around the world with regard to plastics, and also mentioning the big challenges that are there, including the Basel decision there. And I have a lot of questions, but before we come to the questions, I would like to invite Dr. Steve Wang to also give his overview of what's happening particularly in China and the South Asia market. Dr. Steve.
Yes, good morning and also good afternoon. In fact, I'm now in Los Angeles. Here is good evening. It's my pleasure to be here to share my view with everybody through this webinar. And I would like to thank for the opportunity. And also thank you for the nice introduction. I start with a little bit background about China and also about the pandemic effect on our industry. First of all, the plastic industry has experienced the worst ever impacts since beginning of 2020 in respect of sales, turnover, purchase, everything. And the COVID-19 pandemic has devastated our social life, our economy, and also caused a crash in the crude oil prices. So now I come to my second point. The Chinese government released the official report on the outbreak of the coronavirus in Wuhan in January 2020. Although we heard about this virus was actually there since or before December 2019. That's why they call it COVID-19. Approaching Chinese New Year, the epicenter of the virus, Wuhan city, was locked down on 23rd of January. The lockdown order in Wuhan was followed by other major cities in China, such as Beijing, Shanghai, and Guangdong. As workers in China returned home after the Chinese New Year, they were unable to work due to city lockdowns and factory shutdowns. The outbreak of COVID-19 was soon found in other countries, causing the US to restrict entry beginning on 31st of January. Italy enforced lockdown on February 23rd, as additional cases were found in Iran and also other surrounding countries. The US followed closely as lockdown orders began in mid-March for all the Americans. The UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson tested positive for COVID-19, leading to his admittance to intensive care on the 6th of April. Economic activities had come to a standstill as city lockdowns, stay at home or stay home orders, and social distancing measures are adopted by countries to slow the spreading of the virus. Factories suspended for their production, importation of plastic scraps and processed goods were not clear from the customs due to all the lockdowns. Business activity was seen to be 20-30% of the normal productions during this time, and liquidity were worsening. Virgin so now I come to the oil price. Oil price began to decrease mid-February 2020 due to slowing economy, and the WTI oil price dropped into a negative territory level of negative $37 per barrel for the first time ever on April 25th. Oil prices have since recovered to around $36 per barrel recently as a result of production cuts, lifting of lockdowns, and relaxing restrictions. Virgin plastic prices were hit hard by oil prices and lack of demand, and severely affected that of recycled plastics as well. Today, the cost of recycling is more than that of recycled pellets. It's not surprising to see nowadays in Southeast Asian countries, if one had to import plastic scrap from Europe or from the States, we had to count the cost of inland trucking, shipping, and in some countries we need to pay a substantial fees for import custom declaration fees, and plus a very minimum $200-300 for processing. We are now talking about $600-700 at one time. Off-grade or prime PE, PP, PET are even cheaper than the recycled pellets. So at one time there was really no market for the recycler. So now we look at what are the multiple impacts. The plastic recycling industry has suffered from the pandemic as it has disrupted our operation of manufacturing because of the lockdown, because of restriction, because workers are not allowed to travel. And with regards to buying, nowadays, since the shutdown, the lockdown, lots of operations are classified as non-essential. Not every country, even they classify as essential business, right? We still have a problem of workers going to work, and also sorting line are not really operating. So in the end, we cannot buy, and price is also another problem. For selling, it's also not easy because of the prime price compete with the recycled material price. Logistics, again, at one time, especially those countries having this lockdown or restrictions, really nothing has been clear from the customs. So along with the oil prices, due to uncertainties and economic outlook, nobody really want to commit themselves to buying. So now most of recyclers are facing liquidity problems, and they rely heavily on the downstream customers. Liquidity will be affected until the production of the downstream customers. And as what Surendra just said, luckily last couple of weeks or last month, we see light from other end of the tunnel. Things started to move in a relatively positive way, and we need to see how this will last and how our industry will recover. So exporting of scraps from the US, Europe, and Japan is half, as scrap plastic collectors forced to suspend their operation, causing fewer supplies in post-consumer and also industry scraps, especially automobile. And I think some country or some places with heavy industry or different kind of production for automobile, for electronic. Nowadays, not many of the factories are resume operations. Most of municipal plastic scrap in exporting countries are being landfilled due to shutdowns, and also sorting lines are not operating in full capacity. There's a fear of short supplies in plastic scraps. The fluctuating oil prices discourage buyers from committing them to the purchase of their feedstock. So what happened is I had my experience of the last couple of months, hardly we could sell anything. The only thing that you can do is to take position to buy before you can sell. And unreasonable quality claims and cancellation of order are often frequent. During this pandemic, these can be caused by declining oil prices, loss of income causing recyclers to find reasons for additional claims on quality issue or small quality issue. I think people in our business know very well that during the bad time we receive more claim than the normal business situation. And we don't actually can argue with them because in plastic scrap, it's very, very subjective. It's very difficult to prove this is better than others. And in the end, okay, we look at this market outlook. Hopefully, the market outlook will bring us something really positive. So China has reopened the economic activity in April, but factories can only resume about 30-40% of their normal production. This is because of cancellation of order and because domestic consumption are not as good as like before. So the Chinese government also have different stimulus package to stimulate the economy. More house are being building, and also infrastructure is also one of the things that they started now. Hopefully, this can provide more employment and also more consumption of different kind of plastic, apart from plastic, and also different kind of solid waste material. Demand in China is led by construction industries and domestic consumption, while exports are still badly affected until the rest of the world reopens their economy. So for China, although they already lifted all the restriction and also lockdown, on the other hand, China cannot live on their own. They had to wait until the rest of the country open their economy again. So although the lockdown in Southeast Asian countries will be lifted soon, the market outlook remains very, very pessimistic as the global economy will take some time to recover. So today, with more industries in Europe and in the States resuming their economic activity in June, hopefully this will start a new beginning. And good news about our industry is demand of recycled pellets by brand owners is increasing. Changing the concept, traditionally people buy scrap plastic because of economic reason, because of lower their cost of production. Today, instead, the brand owner, they started this off, they buy recycled pellet because of environmental sustainability purpose. The upcoming legislation also might state the use of recycled material mandatory. Last point, there is a new trend of using less plastic materials due to a consensus of the general public being using less. We call it minimalistic. COVID-19 has shown us that our life can go on, can still live with less consumption, less traveling. So today I heard about Surendra, unbelievable that there's so much we can do during this pandemic, and we don't really do much less than before. And we use less fossil oil and fewer industrial activity, which result in a tremendous reduction in our carbon emission. I think this is the only or one of the very, very few good news that we achieved, or we know, and we also achieved the carbon footprints nowadays is first time ever since many, many years. We reduce a lot more carbon emission than before. This is what I have to share. Thank you. Hello. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Steve. Yes.
Yes.
Thank you so much, Dr. Steve.
Yes,
Thank
thank
you
you.
for a
My
detailed
pleasure.
presentation and also the timeline of events. You know, it gives us a sense of development since the start of the COVID crisis and where we stand now with regard to the market. We'll come to the other questions later, but before I pass on the mic to Mr. Shailendra, there's one critical question that's come up here for Mr. Surendra when you had presented that with regard to the crude oil price, you know, it's very low right now, as we know, and the cost of recycled plastic is also quite high. So, and of course, there is no government policy to support plastic recycling as yet. So, how can we make this happen? Though there is an opportunity. Philip Nigu would like to know.
Well, Philip, if you work simply on economics, the plastic recycling would not be viable at this time. I think the prime producers, the converters have a responsibility. I should mention last week there was an article in Fortune magazine from my interview. They interviewed me on Wednesday, and on Friday there was so many remarks that the editor had to restart again and to say that he could fill in the landfill. And the main point was the prime producers are investing billions. You might have heard $200 billion have been invested in US alone. So I think the prime producers, the converters have a responsibility. You cannot simply work on simple economics. There is something called externalities in economics. You are hurting the future generations. You must pay today for the luxury of using plastics, which would hurt the future generations. So personally, I believe that the people who are using recycled, who are producing plastics, who are using plastics, they have a responsibility to pay a premium on the prime materials. So on the PET, this is the case. And these big producers, the big converters have made a commitment to use 25%, 20%, leading up to 30% of their the materials, recycled contents in their production. So definitely the prices have to go higher than the normal economics. Otherwise, the whole system would not work. The cost of collection is high. And I think everybody here in the Western world is resigned to the fact that we have to think about plastic recycling from a different point of view, from a social point of view, from an environmental point of view. And particularly in the Western world, for instance, the Nestle has committed 2 billion euros to pay for these extra premium costs you might heard or you might see in the Google. So with or without low oil prices, these converters have to use the plastics, recycled plastic, to keep their commitment. They have given commitment to the investors, to the fund managers, and it's our responsibility to make sure that these commitments do not remain simply wish list. They must be forced to fulfill these commitments. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Surendra. On the same note, there is another question related to the remarks you made on the Basel Convention. Now, if that is going to hamper trade of recyclables, Perinaz would like to know, is it possible to encourage recycling within a country's borders and then trade in the pellets or other clean recycled material locally rather than having the so-called dirty raw material?
Well, based on the current interpretation of Basel Conventions, I'm sure the domestic recycling would be going up very high. I don't know how far it would succeed because you need certain quantities. Can you imagine in Dubai, you need to collect 2,000 tons of PET waste at one location or 1,000 tons of LDP at one location. It's going to be a challenge. So the economics here is going to be very difficult. I suspect these Basel Convention rules have to be relaxed at some point because they haven't yet still came out with the definition of contaminations. They are working on it. Now talking about the pellets. Here again, I'm going to drop a bombshell. I read 2 months before that they are considering to include the pellet made from plastic waste in the Basel Convention. That would be defeating the whole purpose. I've been talking to the Basel Convention people, and I would be doing, I guess, a Zoom interview with the Secretary General of Basel Convention, Mr. Rolf Poe, and would like to clarify him that you cannot include recycled pellet international trade in the Basel Convention. It was in the newspaper. So definitely the trade in recycled pellet would definitely improve. This might be a temporary misunderstanding, but recycling within the borders, well, every country wants to improve recycling within the border. It's in their interest to provide employment, to provide boost to the economy, but you need a certain economy of scale to make a production unit viable. For instance, in Bombay, if I want to set up a unit for 2,000 tons of LDP every month, it's going to be hell difficult. Mr. Shailendra knows about it. So we have to find a way how we would be able to collect economically to have a domestic recycling, and it's going to be challenging.
Thank you so much. So we have many more questions. I have some questions myself, but before that, I would like to also invite our next panelist to present. India, as we all know, has very high recycling rates on the one hand, but to a great extent, I believe the sector is unorganized, and there are many issues to be addressed. And one industry expert recently just pointed out to me that we would, really need to maximize the very term, so rather examine the very term recycling and how we're really going about it, and also the path that all the stakeholders need to take to make this concept not only of recycling, but also circular economy work in the real sense of the word. I now request Mr. Shailendra Singh to give us an idea of what's happening in the plastic sector in India, the COVID impact on the industry, and also what could possibly be done to make things work better on the plastics recycling front. Mr. Shailendra.
Yeah, so, greetings to everyone, especially the audience. I believe they're tuning in from all parts of the world. It's my pleasure to be on such a esteemed panel and listening to probably two of the stalwarts of the recycling industry globally. I'll try and present the case for India as best as I can over the next 10 minutes. And it's very opportune that this discussion is happening just on the eve of the World Environment Day. So, and just another comment in terms of everything that Surendra ji said and Dr. Steve Wang said, to an entrepreneur should be music to their ears, because the industry is in trouble mode. Everybody is sensitized, including the ministries, average consumer, brands. They're all coming to the party. And whenever there is, whenever an industry is in trouble mode, there's an opportunity lurking somewhere. So there is a little bit of a silver lining. Not everything is as dark clouds as it may appear to be. Moving very quickly to my first slide, I just want to give a quick overview of IPMA for people who may not be aware. It's a 70-year-old organization made of plastic producers, machinery suppliers, 20,000 members, direct, indirect, probably one of the oldest association in India. They were very quickly aligned to the Swachh Bharat mission that was launched by our Honorable Prime Minister. And when you look at recycling in the context of at a higher level, it's about Swachh Bharat to begin with. Several works been done in terms of linking and being the link between policymakers and the industry. We have also done some voluntary EPR, etc. You can read more about them on the web, on their web site. But the point I wanted to make is that as an association, they are transforming themselves to becoming a knowledge-based association that actively works with issues on the ground And towards that, and sensing that there would be opportunities coming in the future, they've also been granted, with the blessings of the government of India, the approval to set up incubation centers. So one in Delhi and one in Bombay, which I think over the next 2 to 5 years will hopefully germinate good ideas which are relevant for the Indian market. Quickly to the next slide, I think my previous panelists have talked a lot about what happened. Here is what I saw, in the short term, where the entire world, in India included, with a 3-hour notice, went into lockdown. I think the key things are that, materials that were needed to lead our daily lives, your rice and atta and atta as in wheat flour and dal, those were considered essential services. Those did not get impacted negatively. In fact, there was some impact, but not as much. Because hotels and restaurants were closed, the big size packaging got impacted. As Indians know, whenever there is sign of trouble, we hunker down very quickly and come down to what is essential. So clearly things like chocolates and cola and tobacco products, all of that were hit probably a little bit harder. Production due to social distancing, all of that really created negative impact overall, a sense of what's happening and what's going on. On the plus side, though, one saw pharma products and medical devices or medical applications see an upswing. And just linking back to what Surendra ji said in his opening comments, there is a huge need for PPE products, masks, gloves, so on and so forth. And I'll just give you an interesting statistic. And this is what has led to the local industry waking up. The industry needs about 1 crore bottles, sanitizer bottles per day. The capability of the industry today is to make only 500,000 per day. And what's stopping us is not the bottles, it is the pump at the top of the bottles, which many of you may not know was entirely imported from China. This has come as a big shock to several people within the industry, and I think it's come, it's also come with its lessons. The industry, the plastic recycling industry, largely in India, is in the medium and small medium enterprise. So when the business cycle stops, they are under financial strain. The labor that they were working with wants to go home. Cash cycles have been disrupted, and so all of that has led obviously to severely slowing down of the activities. Now, what I don't mention on this slide, but was covered by my panelists before me, was the impact of oil prices. That's just been what I believe, and they've covered it, so I'm not going to go in detail. But what has happened is that has created what I call the perfect storm for the recycling industry. And as a consequence of that, I see some consolidation happening in this space. There's obviously a case for some sort of change that is needed to adapt to the new world, as I like to call it. Moving to the next slide. And this is just a quick look, and with whatever's happening in the background, there's been, whether the plastic has been seen as the hero. Again, my previous panelists talked a lot about it, so I'm not going to go in detail. But the villain part is, this whole thing about it's mixed with the solid waste stream, and the littering. All of that is also giving a negative perception of plastics. What it has done, though, is it has raised a question and the debate about what is single-use plastics. And as some of you know, there was a notification by the ministry in India it was a notification or guidelines is the right word, to states, and some states started banning single-use plastics in huge fervor. Some implemented it lackadaisically, and some were saying, we're not really doing much. So the whole debate on single-use plastics has started again. I sense in the dialogue that there is less resistance now, or less inclination now towards banning as a step. I don't think that helps solve any problem. The Central Pollution Control Board and others did come out with a lot of guidelines to the municipalities, how to handle the biomedical waste that's being generated, particularly out of isolation centers, hospitals, etc. But then also the issue is, how do you implement it on the ground? Whilst talking to one of the biomedical waste treatment facility owner, what he said was that we have the capability to handle the waste, provided the waste that arrives at this facility is not mixed with municipal solid waste. If that happens, the capacity is choked out. So I think the government and district level people did understand the criticality, and nothing works perfectly. I'm not saying it's all working like a perfectly oiled machine, but we haven't yet heard of reports where the biomedical waste treatment facility is under stress. So things, of course, need to be much better than where they were today. Now, this also has then brought the whole collection and segregation and disposal issue, funnily enough, for all of plastics back into the center stage. And so people now understand how critical it is to really collect everything and segregate if you have to create value going on from there. So the period of lockdown and the gigantic issues that the state machinery and everybody in the country had to deal with has raised some very good questions. And I hope, that there is earnest application of science and logic and investments to address that. And hiding in here are the signs of possible opportunities, which I'll cover in my following slides. Now, no matter what we do, and again, I'm not going to spend too much of time here. No matter what we do, we are going. People talk about plastic marine litter entering into the marine chain. The point I wanted to make with this slide is that the waste generation is not going to go down; it's going to go up, and you cannot de-link plastic waste management from solid waste management. So I think that those are intertwined. One also needs to understand that, at least in India, there is both a formal chain and an informal chain. And so at least with plastics, a lot of the high value plastics like PET bottles, milk pouches, etc., they get collected preferentially. But there is still a lot left that enters into the municipal solid waste stream, and you need technologies to be able to separate these valuable resources from there. So the point I want to make here is you cannot de-link solid waste from plastic waste. And so as a pointer to the industry, you can't say, well, I know a lot about plastics, but give it to me in a clean form. One has to get in and be part of the equation to recover those resources. And clearly the terminology, it's not a waste, it's a resource. I think that mindset change needs to happen. A quick view here in terms of, and I'm sure several people on this call would have seen the graph on the left-hand side of the slide, which talks about plastic consumption in India. It is still one of the lowest in the world on a per capita basis. And then on the right-hand side, I've tried to give you some typical applications of plastic scrap as it gets dealt with in the system today. Apart from the apparel, and to your point, Swalia, about is this really recycling? I think the word recycling has been used very loosely, but keeping that aside for the purpose of this presentation, the success story of bottles being converted to fibers is unprecedented. I haven't seen this in any part of the world anywhere. And This happened not now, it happened 2 decades before in India. And it was not driven by any regulation. It was not driven by state governments. It was driven by the pure Indian entrepreneurial spirit, where you attach value to a resource, it gets picked up and it gets recycled or upcycled, whatever you like to call it. Milk bags is where it gets picked up and gets converted into LDP granules. So the point of this whole slide is that the consumption is in the lowest in the world in per capita basis. The aspirational aspect of Indian population is not going to cut this down. It's only going to grow. There's 400, 500 million people. The demographics of India are very, very favorable. They're all, the age 400, 500 million people in the age group of below 25 to 30. These are consumers of tomorrow. So, like Surendra ji said, there is a problem, and you got to deal with it, and you got to deal with it within your borders. And in that context, I'd like to commend our Prime Minister for launching his latest initiative, which is becoming Atmanirbhar, or becoming self-reliant. Of course, it's going to take a lot to become self-reliant, and hopefully I'll be able to touch on some points in the coming slide. The other point I also want to make is that the current recycling technology in India, I'm sorry to say, is primitive. It needs a huge boost, not only in terms of technology, but also in terms of capability. We are not able to make the high-end value-added products that customers would want. Talking about brand owners wanting recycled content into their packaging, brand owners also have very high standards that they will ask for in terms of contamination, in terms of traceability, in terms of accountability. And the industry is woefully short, primarily because of the way it has grown in the past. A lot of the operators were ma and pa kind of operations. So there is, and the positive side here is, I see a great opportunity for professionally run large recycling companies entering into this sector. And the government is also taking some steps to make that happen. The government is also very aware that you need more recyclers if you have to do this locally. So over the last 6 months, several recyclers have got what they call consent to operate. So at least, you're bringing many of these informal recyclers into the formal chain. And that only then lends for better control, better regulation, improvements in technology, so on and so forth. There's also increased discussion on integrated waste management sites. There are talks about establishing plastic parks. As you go up the value chain and the talk of circularity and sustainability comes up, almost inbuilt in that is that the waste streams need to be cleaned up. Now, you can't say, well, I can recycle, but, give me the raw material cleaned up. Waste is a new raw material. We've got to learn to adapt to it. And I think there is a learning for the industry there. This slide, I'd like to actually thank Dr. Habbu. I don't know whether he's on the call or not, but it really put everything in perspective in such a nice way. So the chain, as you can see, is pretty complex, and the two or three points that I wanted to make on this slide is, we talk a lot about physical and mechanical recycling, but there's a whole new world of chemical recycling that, at least in India, I wouldn't say has even started. People are still looking at it, skeptic, and trying to find what the right technologies could be. But as you get more and more plastic, more and more litter, and then gaps in terms of the basic segregation habit, that's also leading to anger and protests. So if we think that, well, with COVID, plastic is back in action, let me tell you that human beings have very short memory. Once the burst is behind us, the voices against plastics will come back. And the point I want to make is that as an industry, we have to have a scientific, a logical based response to the emotional fervor that eventually, that we see so often. And towards that, I think if stakeholders, multi-stakeholder conference platforms are formed, like the one Alliance to End Plastic and others that are forming, that they bring some science and logic to the equation. Whether we like it or not, plastic as a raw material has definite value that it brings to the table. And you cannot just brush it away. The other thing that we are seeing because of the complexity is a lot of talk about bioplastics. And there's confusion between what is bioplastic and what is biodegradable plastics. But again, that as a segment could be an opportunity in the future. This is my last slide, and I'll try to make it quick. But when you look at what will really drive the plastic recycling industry in India, and there are many factors, but the one that I would like to talk about is the waste management side of it. And then to my earlier point, that collection and segregation is integral. And let me also inform the audience that the industry, the ministry, people in this space have recognized that for a vast country like India, if you don't have an integrated chain, you will not get anywhere. And that there are coalitions and alliances forming in the background. The government has issued money and design of MRFs, as they call it, to urban land bodies. And let me assure you that a lot of work is going on in the background. There's also work to integrate the rag pickers or the resource recovery agents, as I like to call them, into the formal sector. In terms of demand, my previous panelists have spoken about brands wanting recycled content, but there are a few select brands that are even thinking of, at the time of launch, at the time of a design of a product, can the packaging be designed in from recycled plastic? So there is work going on there. Of course, there are issues around economics and how they play out. And to that point, to the discussion earlier, I think the way economics of recycled plastics versus virgin plastics is looked at needs a fundamental change that I think Surendra ji was referring to, where the cost of damage to the environment needs to be built in. And you'll find that recycled polymers are really not that expensive. And for particularly on the case of India, for a country that's oil dependent, I'd want to convert every kilogram of plastic, because at some point, whether it gets converted to energy or oil, at some point that is saving billions of dollars for the Indian government. On the financial support, there are various instruments. I'm glad, and the high point I want to make here is that now the financial institutions are getting into the game. There's a lot of talk about soft capitalism or social capitalism, which I think is good for the industry because it brings in what I call patient capital. They're willing to work with the system, willing to run for longer periods, slightly longer periods, based on the framework of the industry versus normal investments. EPR is something that's being discussed heavily. Some versions of EPR have been tried, and there's a good discussion between the ministry and brands and collecting agents. And I think the whole EPR system in India needs to evolve to a much higher scale, but I see the green shoots of that beginning to happen. Regulations, at the point I want to make here, Bureau of Industrial Standards, FSSAI related to food safety are acutely aware of what needs to be changed. I think what's lacking is a collaborative platform that takes data to them and say, this is what we made from recycled waste, here's the testing we have done, and here's the performance. 2 points, and I'll end my talk here. People talk about regulations in India being loose, but we also forget that India is about one of the 4 or 5 countries in the world that has a National Green Tribunal, which was set up on the principles of sustainable development and polluter pays principle. We talk about circular economy, and India has miles to go, but you will be pleasantly surprised that the state of Goa has actually published a circular economy plan for that state. I hope that the ministry is working on a resource efficiency policy that will come out soon. And lastly, I just want to say that the knock that COVID has given the industry, and I only wish it didn't take a pandemic for us to realize that, has raised a lot of questions, a lot of issues, and I think the industry is now coming to grips with that. And in the midst of all this, I see several opportunities emerging. Thank you. I'll end with that. I think thank you so much for your patience. We can go on and on. It's such a large subject, but thank you very much for your attention. I hope in that short time I've been able to do some justice to the situation in India. Thank you very much. Over to you, Swalia.
Thank you so much, Mr. Shailendra. Yes, of course, you have done justice. You've kind of given us a very holistic picture of what is happening at the ground level and what the situation is right now. And there are a lot of questions coming up here related to, also, you had mentioned plastic bottles. I think Jerome would like to know, Mr. Surendra, I'd like you to take that question. Several European countries announced last year that in 2020, they would implement a regulation for plastic bottle production equal to all new bottles. That what they said was new bottles need to consist of a minimum of 30 to 50% of recycled PE, PP, or PET. I assume COVID-19 has caused delay here. What's the short-term outlook?
Well, when it comes to PET, the market has become mature. I think the PET is one example when it comes to plastic recycling, which has trailblazed new way of thinking. And like Shailendra said, it's the real recycling, it's upcycling. I call it, you are able to make the same material from which originally the plastic waste came from. So the PET is in a rather relatively shape. And I think European industry would be able to achieve the target which they have foreseen before. I do not have the exact figure at the moment, but it's going in the right spirit. That's what I hear from the market around. So as far as the PET is concerned, the situation is well under control. That's my firm belief.
Yeah. Sir, if I can add a comment on that, Solia, in terms of an opportunity for the recycling industry, what I believe is that although brands in Europe particularly have talked about a certain content in their packaging field, they also have to prove that the recycled pellets was made out of waste that was collected in that country. So to the earlier point about things getting a little bit between borders is something that I believe is being discussed or is implicitly is implied in the way the regulations are structured in Europe.
I think I'd like to add one very important point. If you see the pricing pattern of the recycled PET, all along, consistently during the last almost a year, the prices of recycled PET has been exceeding the prices of the PET, prime PET. Somebody has been giving me a figure of between 20 to 30%. So clearly the European regulation is working towards this front.
Absolutely.
Right. Thank you. There's another question here now related to China. Nadia would like to know, China has curbed recycling, and no, what she means, I think, is that China has actually put restrictions on imports of plastics quite a bit. So are Far East markets alternative options? And is there any other new market large enough and prepared to accommodate the huge incoming influx of recyclables?
Is that for me?
Yes, any of the panelists can take that question, yes.
Maybe I can comment on this point. I give you some number about China. Before they shut down the border, China has been importing about 7 million tons of plastic scrap per annum. And since the shutdown or the plastic ban, the recycler moved to Southeast Asian country. Today, my estimate of number of recyclers in Southeast Asian countries are not less than 20,000. When I talk about 20,000, right, it means something, because in order for each factory to be able to survive, they need to recycle at least 200 to 300 tons. Actually, this is very, very minimum. And when you put like 20-something thousand times 200-300 tons per month, we are talking about a few million tons per month. So there's no issue about capacity. The problem of the recycler have, right, is a mismatching of material or mismatching of the scrap. The one that the plastic recycler like to have, right, they are not able to get it at the price they like. So at this moment, the operation rate or the production capacity is about few times more than what they actually operate. In other words, we have a overcapacity because of the mismatching. And also to come back to another point about recycled content. Today, same thing. On one hand, we have lots of brand owners looking for material, and Surendra said, okay, PET is well controlled. On the other hand, what is not controlled, right? Because when we talk about recycled content, most of the brand owners are looking for, first of all, the color, and secondly, mechanical and chemical property. And also at this moment, it's only HDPE and PET bottle flake are selling. The rest are not selling. So recyclers are not able to survive. They really look for not only subsidies, it's only a policy. When people talk about recycled content, they never talk about that we want to have like PP black or PP gray or PE PP mix. Okay, it's not like this. It's always talk about natural. So these are the challenges that people outside recycling industry might not understand.
Absolutely.
So in fact, we don't have the problem of like capacity. We have overcapacity. It's a matter of the price. It's a matter of what kind of material. In fact, talking about plastic, every single plastic can be recycled. It's a matter of the system. It's a matter of how you do it. And in the end, we have lots of plastic going to landfill simply because the money is not there. And then the incentive is not there because recycled content seldomly talk about anything other than PET or HDPE natural. So this is also the point that I addressed at the UN Basel Convention, one of the couple of the working group about recycled content, about our industry. More and more people are going bankrupt. This is what I want to say. It's not an issue of
Mr. Surendra?
a capacity.
I'd like to add the word perspective. In 2015-16, the international trade used to be in the region of 15 to 16 million tons every year in the plastic waste. Can you believe it's gone down to 5 million tons?
Wow.
So the drop has been substantial from 15 million tons in a matter of 5 years to almost 5 million tons. I can give more and more figures, but I would be more specific. The areas, the countries where the plastic recycling is increasing is Turkey. Turkey was not an important player about 5 years before. Now Turkey is importing substantial quantity. Eastern Europe, and I think the European government has opened up their treasuries. So it's going to be the East Europe who's going to benefit substantially from their recovery plans. So these are the two countries, two areas where I feel there would be boost in the demand for plastic waste.
So Albert Khan here asks, can you talk about, he would like to know about the COVID-19 crisis, how it has impacted the efforts to create a plastics recycling circular economy. This is a very timely topic these days that has been discussed by brands, recyclers, and waste management companies. So So, yeah, I'd like to add on to that to ask, what is the state now with regard to actually the collection rates and especially with regard to plastics? Because it's not like other commodities. So has this been affected a great deal?
Can I comment on these things? First of all, when I just now mentioned about the collection, and also nowadays we will see there will be less supply of plastic. I think partly, only small part, because of the COVID-19. The main thing is the cost, because it's not worth doing it. A few years ago, we still see people collect like very low grade PE film. We still see people collect, we call it 127, 327. Today, this is simply just not working, okay? And then come back to whether this COVID-19 affect the circular economy, the use of recycled content. In fact, this is not really causing much. The thing that, okay, even after the COVID-19, we still have this problem of what I just mentioned earlier. We are in contact with, okay, I don't want to mention about the brand owner's name, but they're all like the same thing, okay? They first of all look for material there which is food grade or food contact or FDA approved, all these things, right? They just simply not enough material. And an example is right for PET. I think, okay, the whole world have about 350 million tons of plastic produced every year. And PET account for, as a packaging, or the most collected scrap plastic. And I think PET accounts for maybe at least 40, 50 million tons of PET resin that end up okay, to be collected. Might be we have at least 10 or 20 million tons because of 30%. And with this 10 or 20%, right, at this moment, I think brand owner, they committed themselves to use like recycled content 30%. And when we talk about the whole world, in China at this moment, because I'm also involved in the statistic and I also try to put the recycler in China in contact with the brand owner. And so far, none of the recycler for PET that I know, they are eligible to provide or to supply recycled content food grade PET. So there's also a mismatching again, because the requirement just too high,
Yeah.
and then you need to invest lots of money. Yeah.
Yeah. Can I just add yeah, go ahead, Solia.
Sure. One of you.
Yeah, just a couple of points from the India perspective. And again, this is for the recycling community to think about that if it's related to the circular economy and closing the loop, then there are certain technologies that will, and they are largely in the chemical recycling space, that will get preferential treatment, number one. Number two, in a country like India, where we are short of power, we are looking at alternate sources of power. Coal is the main source of power. What will happen is there'll be a competing force for the waste. Because if you look at waste, the content in that has got very high calorific value is actually plastic. And so with all the struggle over the last 20, 30, 2, 3 decades about education, consumer awareness, all of that, it hasn't gotten anywhere. Dump sites are increasing in size. And so one could be tempted to look at waste to energy plants, as an alternate way to first immediately get over the issue. Third, there's an economic reason that's driving this. The value of land on which the dump sites sit has more than increased in value more than 10 times. And the revenues that the government's losing because of potential construction activity is huge. So therefore, when you look at cost, it's a relative cost to the economy. And I think what COVID has done is reset the button in terms of how you look at costing. I think some of these arguments will become more powerful now. And so therefore, if you're in the game of mechanical recycling, you have to up your technology and start looking at value-added products, because what I foresee in the next 3 to 5 years is a competition.
We're losing your voice. Sorry, I think he's having some audio issues.
Yeah, I'm here. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. Sorry, I am just saying that the landscape on the resource availability will change dramatically. And so, if you're in the field of mechanical recycling, to the point Dr. Steve mentioned about, you know, ability to make recycled contents with certain minimum contamination, getting the product color right, etc. These are now critical, not nice to have. These are critical things that the industry has to start looking at, because this is what the new world brings with it. There's
On
still time.
So on the same point of COVID and affecting recyclables, is particularly plastic. Now, PPE is one of the biggest issues, I believe, because residences are using commercial facilities and everyone else is using the PPEs. So there's a problem with the collection. Now, Chris Barber would like to know, actually he's asking a right question. Shouldn't the governments, shouldn't people be putting pressure on the governments to actually ensure that the PPE waste is segregated at source? Any comments from Europe, China, and...
So I let the
stalwarts.
Surendra?
Yes, I'll ask Mr. Surendra to comment on this.
Well, the European government has been pioneer in this. As I said to you earlier, I see during the last 2-3 months, they have opened up their treasuries. They are going to spend 15 to 20%, even 25% of their GDP. And obviously, this is one of the aspects they're addressing to. Holland has been doing extraordinary work, particularly the Delft University. So there's no doubt about it that the government is taking the responsibility fully, even without this COVID PPE issues. We in Belgium have to segregate our waste right at the source in 5 different bins. So I think personally, I feel Europe is not going to suffer a big challenge. We are not used to picking up, dropping the PPE on the ground. And I took a photo yesterday. What a nice photo I saw while walking along the street. There was one senior gentleman picking up by his own special stick all the PPE lying around. I wish we could circulate all around the world. So I don't see a big problem for sorting and disposal of PPE. Of course, the amount has come up too far, too quick in the volume, but Europe is reasonably prepared to handle this issue.
Right.
From an Indian perspective,
scenario, yeah, I think it's a very different scenario in the Middle East and India. So yes, Mr. Shailendra.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know whether Chris was getting at, segregation so that it can be recycled, but
No,
the point.
So basically, sorry to interrupt. It's basically because it's all mixed. Now it's getting difficult to even segregate the other plastics. People are worried about the quality and contamination levels. So that's the point he's trying to make.
Right. So in the short term, there was a problem because as COVID hit, people didn't even want to talk to the rack pickers or the garbage collectors. And unfortunately, they've been actually on the front lines, managing our waste while we merrily throw it out. Clearly, yes. So if you look at the Central Pollution Control Board guidelines, there is a clear guideline on how you will and what kind of bags you will collect these waste in, how will you dispose it off, so on and so forth. The issue is on the ground. I think the asset and infrastructure isn't ready, number one. Number two, the perception in the minds of the consumer is that now, whether there is any contaminated waste or not, there is a mindset that it is contaminated primarily because of the history. You don't have to be an expert to know that, how waste gets commingled when it comes to the municipal thing. So the people who matter, and I think to me, it's the ward councillor at the municipality at the ground level where this implementation has to be done. And and as you know, it will never be 100%. Surendra ji talked about a gentleman picking up PPE masks from the street. Somebody threw it on the street, right? So in India, it does get to be a big challenge, but it's more asset driven, and I think also in some cases awareness driven.
Right. So how does Parth would like to know, how does one offset the high capex of BMW units at what level? One of the key factors in faster adoption.
The question.
I think we are losing you. For now, I'll read Tony Wong's question. I think, Mr. Surendra, the UK government encourages plastic recycling with their PRN, that's the Packaging Recovery Note subsidy, though he personally says he doesn't completely agree with the system as it stands today. There is more economic viability for the UK recycling industry. Are ambassadors such as you encouraging other governments in Europe or other countries to engage in similar systems?
I think we would have no choice. I think when it comes to the cost and analysis of economics of recycling, every stakeholder has to give in their contribution, whether it's the government, whether it's the association. And I think when it comes to plastic recycling, the contribution from the industry has been coming up far too late. If I compare it with the rubber recycling, our company recycles 50 million tires every year. Can you believe in Belgium, there is a subsidy of 180 euro per ton, 180 euro per ton. So sooner or later, everyone has to recognize that there has to be contribution from all the stakeholders, from the government, from the brand owners, to be ready to pay a premium, and also from the consumers. I think plastic at this moment is more of a luxury essential item, and you must be prepared to pay for the recycling for the next generation, for your great generations.
Thank you. So Asma Ghanem comments here that although it is commendable that people in India, this is with reference to India, they've found ways to repurpose plastic and create clothing or shoes out of it. It's mostly textiles now. And we know that plastic fibers and clothing materials can be harmful when they are, improperly discarded. And most of it ends in landfill. In fact, a couple of days back, Adriana from Circular Economy Asia was saying the same thing. Like in India, Mr. Shailendra. So the thing is now, how can this be managed? I mean, we really are talking about recycling. This is where the term comes into play.
Yeah. So good question, Asma. And, a couple of things I think in India, first of all, the culture is not, use and throw, not yet, at least. Use and reuse till the t-shirt gets converted into a swapping cloth and then throw. Number one. Number two, having said that, there is a large amount of textile waste that ends up into the landfill. And to me, that's because if you're talking about packaging plastics being an issue, textile waste and managing textile waste are even more complex. And let me assure you, since I also do some work on sustainable apparels, that this is a big problem that the world's brands and technology providers are working on. Most of you may not know that out of the total fibers that are used in the world, 60% of that is polyester. And so that's another valuable resource that needs to be recovered. However, this polyester is always blended with some cotton or something else. And in a textile heap of clothes, it's very difficult to recover that. But the best of minds are working. There are some enzymatic based technologies that can recover polyester preferentially. So those things are happening. And one of the things that we don't talk about so much is, also working on what I would like to call responsible consumerism. And I think that's another lesson I think that COVID has taught many consumers. Dr. Steve Wang referred to it in his comments that people now will buy only what they want to buy and try to lead a minimalistic kind of lifestyle. So it's not an easy question. It does need a multiple prong effort, but I can assure you, in India, for example, there is a platform of industry stakeholders that's formed that's working precisely on this in terms of how do we manage the textile waste and prevent it from going into landfills.
Right. Actually, we are running out of time, but I have one or two questions before we conclude. Dr. Steve, with China's new regulations and with the COVID conditions, now what do you think would be the post-COVID scenario, and also the impact of plastics trade in particular with regard to China and East Asia in the near future?
I think since China can only import recycled pellets, so all the scraps go to China has to be recycled into pellet and to comply with what the requirement is. At this moment, China really had to rely on in order to buy lots of recycled pellet. China need to wait until their domestic consumption increase to a levels that as pre-pandemic situation. And also, only China is not enough. We need the whole world to reopen their economy. And we talk about domestic. In fact, China is now collecting more and more domestic waste, as what I know, and there are lots of programs to give incentive or to encourage recyclers domestically to collect their waste. So I see the recycling rate is going higher and higher in China. And the only thing that we still see is the application. I think China is now also developed lots of infrastructure, building houses. And one thing that we don't know because of the uncertainty on trade war with the States and also with the whole world. Lots of countries now, they are considering repatriate or they considering to move their factory out of China for economic and also political reasons. So this is what I feel, and this is what's happening.
Right.
Yeah.
Thank you. Mr. Surendra, any comments on the short-term outlook for the sector in general?
Well, I like to show my passion. This is an issue which we have no choice. The world has no choice. I want to give a global perspective. Every day, we are generating 800,000 tons of plastic waste. I read one of the chat box from Miss Anita Noori, the lake of education. And I think that's the issue. People are not aware about the enormity of the plastic problem. Every hour, if you think there are 2,000 truckloads of waste being generated. And at this rate, considering the recycling which we are doing, by 2050, as Shailendraji put it there would be almost 12 billion tons of plastic waste. We are talking about billions. The production of new plastic is increasing by more than 3%. Recycling is increasing by less than 2%. So the problem is so enormous. This is the point I'm trying to convey all across the world. This is something, why don't we accept it? Why don't we realize we have to do it? And this has come at a stage, whether you do it with the different ways, like only last week, European government has come out with plastic waste tax. You might have heard. They are thinking to raise 7 billion euros from the plastic waste tax. And they are thinking to use it to support COVID. My God, they should be using this money to promote recycling. So we all have a responsibility to raise the awareness across the world, including the consumers. We are taking things so much for granted. Plastic, I believe, if you ask me, one of the best invention any human mankind has ever made is the plastic, for its flexibility, for innovation, for all kind of things you can point it out, and it's so economical. You cannot live without plastic. Sometime I say even for 2 hours. We all have a responsibility, and this responsibility should include to pay for this use of what I call an essential luxury.
Thank you. So on the same point, an expert had just mentioned to me a few days back that maybe, the economy ministry should be more involved on this side rather than having it as an environmental issue. I think the ministry, if the economy steps in, maybe they will start looking at the business side of it and also at the opportunities. What are your comments?
I think in United Arab Middle East, particularly, you have a very highly proactive minister. Uh, your environment minister, Dr. Thani, he happened to be my co-speaker in World Economic Forum. And I said to him that, look, I can give you a list of all the companies who came up in in Middle East, who started to do the plastic recycling business, and they failed. And he immediately asked, what was the reason? I said, you don't have enough inputs. He called one of the senior executive from Al Futain Group. He said, we have to sit down, we have to do with the economic ministry, and we would make sure we would open up the plastic. So I think your idea that we have to have the commerce ministry, economic ministry, and also, of course, the environment ministry to take a firm decision, more so in India, Shailendraji. I think one ministry alone cannot take a decision. As I see when I talk to Amitabh Ji Kant and different people who are responsible, so we all have a responsibility. This is a problem of not individual. It's a huge issue, and this is what we have to spread around through education, the ignorance of the enormity of the problem. Thank you.
Right. Thank you so much. There are so many comments and questions. Unfortunately, we've already, overstepped by half an hour. We were planning this as a 1-hour session, and it was so interesting. I think that people are on here. Just one small question to Dr. Steve before I conclude. Jeroen would like to know if China, if you were saying that China is able to import recycled PET, do you mean the pellets or flakes?
Yeah, actually, I meant the PET pellet. PET pellet, because China will not allow importation of regrind, flake, and popcorn, all this. Yeah. So and then when you import pellet, has to comply with uniform size, color, and packing. Yeah.
Right. Thank you so much. It's been a totally engaging conversation. I hope all the audience enjoyed this. So what is it that we can do as international recycling fraternity? Now, could we have a framework, say with clear goals, and through dialogue get the necessary commitment from all to work on the various aspects addressed here? For that, I think we really need the collaboration between all the stakeholders, starting right from the government to the manufacturers, to the recycling industry, the waste management sector, consultants, R&D departments, and of course, most importantly, the communities to really make this work. So I don't believe this conversation ends here. We will continue this in various forums. And as I already said, due to time constraints, we would have to close the session now. It's been an honor to host this webinar, and I thank all our esteemed panelists for joining us today and sharing their insights. To all those who have tuned in, a big thank you for your participation. There are many more such interesting sessions coming up, and I hope in the near future we'll be able to host another one for plastics as well, because this is a central subject that's being addressed worldwide right now. So stay tuned, stay safe. Thank you all.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Ayla, for the great contribution the Middle East waste recycling is doing. You are bringing so much awareness. We are so grateful. Thank you so much.